they don't know. It's where I've been and who I am, all the ways I've grown. Blood and the sweat, tears and regret made me hard as stone. On my own, on my own.
Do it.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome. My name is Kayla Payne, and I'm the branch manager of the Duncan Library over on Commonwealth Avenue, just down the street. Thank you for joining us here tonight for our amazing author that we have visiting us. I do want to let you all know that we have another author talk at the library on June 5th at 6 p.m. It is the author Vinoy Bashit, who wrote Silent Winds, Dry Seas, and they are a local DC author. So if you're interested in hearing more authors share about their work, please check out our website. And if you are interested in supporting all the wonderful programs and initiatives that we have at the library, you can join the Friends of the Duncan Library, and they help us put on wonderful programs such as this and for our Summer Quest Kids reading program. Without further ado, I'll introduce my amazing predecessor that some of you may know, Mr. Brack Stovall.
Thank you, Kayla. In addition to the Friends of the Duncan Library, one of the things I want to also push is that the library is a part of the community, a center of the community. And by the way we operate, we really do look at it as incorporating the whole community. And in this event tonight, the Ray Artisans were very kind to give us this space, which I think is perfect for our topic, Get the Picture. If you look around you, maybe you'll get the picture. So, and tonight also, Hooray for Books, who is located on King Street, an independent bookstore. They are here with copies of Get the Picture. And Bianca, I think you will sign them at the end of the day. Yes? Anything you want. She'll sign it, even whatever. Anyway, so I first met Bianca back, I believe it was 2016 when she came and did a program for us. It may have been 17 when she did a program for us. I reached out to her when she wrote an article in, I believe it was Harper's or Atlantic. It was on fake wines, and I was intrigued, and so I said, well, I'm just going to send her a question and see if she's interested in doing a program at the library, because we were doing a program on imitation art or fake art that had been out in the and who knew that would be your next topic? It would be art. But she was very kind and generous and reached back, and she had a book coming out called Cork Dork, and she shared it with me. I read it. It was absolutely hilarious, and I thought it was one of it was just I told her she is like the George Plimpton of all of the cultural aspects that we rely on to make our lives worthwhile in the world. And so she's the one who jumps in and does all the legwork. And so without further ado, I'm going to let her take over and talk about Get the Picture. And thank you very much for coming tonight. And I'm looking forward to this just like y'all.
I feel like a lounge singer right now. I love it. Thank you all so much for coming. I feel just so kind of in love with this community already. Hopefully the feeling will be mutual by the end of the evening. We'll see. But I came in a little earlier this afternoon, and I was working in the library, which was just such a gift. So thank you for having me there and here. And then this space feels like, I feel like I've walked into like my dream sort of community arts center. This is just so special and wonderful. And we have an independent bookstore, and we have people. So I feel like we could just all go home now. This is like a platonic thing. I am going to be talking to you about art this evening, surrounded by art, which I do agree is very appropriate. It is a bit surreal for me to be doing this, though, because for a very long time, art and I were not on speaking terms. I know that perhaps many of you are artistically inclined, and so this may not be a familiar feeling for you. But I would have this experience where I would go to galleries and museums, and I consistently felt like I was at least 2 tattoos and a master's degree away from figuring out what the hell was going on. And maybe some of you have had that experience. You go into one of these, brightly lit rooms. This is an exception. This again, I just feel good vibes here. But you've been there, right? These brightly lit rooms with their stark white walls and their, hushed rooms, and you turn a corner to, there's someone trying to escape, I don't know. You turn a corner to find a bunch of people really seriously contemplating a sculpture of rotting vegetables on a stained mattress. And you feel like, okay, like everyone gets the punchline except me. That at least was my feeling. Art had been a passion of mine growing up, but by the time I sort of got older, I didn't feel like there was a place for me. I felt like I didn't know how to engage. I felt way out of my league. And I took the coward's route out and I withdrew. And I can't imagine that much would have changed. But a few years back, I was at my childhood home in Oregon, helping my mom clean the basement, which is, of course, where all good book ideas begin. And I came across this watercolor of these dancing carrots made by my late grandmother that was inspired by her time as a Holocaust survivor in a displaced persons camp after the war. She was an economist. She was trained as an economist. She had no artistic inclination that I knew of. And she had no children. And yet she found herself in this DP camp and started teaching art classes to the children. And she helped them organize this dance performance where they dressed up as carrots and danced. And these carrots haunted me. Like, they trailed me back to New York, and they kept dancing my mind round and round this question of why my grandmother had treated art, which was to me arguably the least essential thing, as essential. Why was it this thing that she had turned to at this moment when life turned itself inside out? And I thought, maybe by turning my back on art, I was missing out on something actually very big. And so I thought, okay, I would try again. I started going back out to galleries and museums, and I couldn't look away. I am someone who is obsessed with obsession. That's a sort of through line between these two books. And when it came to these art lovers and these art fiends, I'd never met a group of people willing to sacrifice so much for something of, to me, so little obvious practical value. Artists who treated, 100-year-old paintings like they were as necessary as a liver. Gallery owners who maxed out credit cards to show these deformed hunks of metal they swore could change the world. And I was fascinated to learn that scientists are actually right there with artists and telling us that art is a fundamental part of our humanity. As one biologist puts it, as necessary to us as food or sex. I didn't know the feeling, but I was intrigued. And I also felt a little disturbed. I felt like these art lovers, these artists, they had this expansive approach to life that made my own existence feel totally claustrophobic by comparison. Just to give you a sense of where my head was at this point in time, I was one of these, hyper-optimized New Yorkers who spend a lot of time texting from the toilet while listening to podcasts on 2 times speed, like a sick puppy. And these art lovers, they acted like they'd accessed these trap doors in their brains. And to be fair, they pitied me. They told me that I lacked visual literacy, which they said was downright dangerous in a world like ours that is so saturated with images. And so long story short, I became consumed with this question of whether I could see art, whether I could see the world the way they did, and what might change if I could. And I decided that I wanted to throw myself into the nerve center of the fine art world to see what I might find out about why art matters, about how any of us can engage with it more deeply. Now, when I say throw myself into the center of it, I do mean it rather literally. I am a journalist, and like a lot of journalists, I do interviews and I read research reports, but I also believe in learning by doing. And I had this plan, this admittedly pushy plan, that I was actually going to go work in the art world. I was going to get right into the middle of the action because for one thing, as I later learned, it is one thing to ask a gallerist how they sell an artwork in an interview and have them give you some nice, polite answer about, passion for art, etc. And it is quite another, as I later discovered, to, sell art like thousands of dollars worth of art from the backseat of an Uber during the craziness of Art Basel Miami Beach's fairs while people are doing cocaine around you. Like, this is, how the art market runs, apparently, in some cases. And I also wanted to see, how does an artwork go from being this germ of an idea in someone's studio to this quote-unquote masterpiece that we fawn over at museums? Because I felt like all the decisions that affect an artwork are also ultimately decisions that affect us. Our idea of what art is, who makes it, why we should bother to engage with it. And so I thought, okay, I want to get in there, I want to see how this happens. No one except me thought this was a good idea. I started reaching out to people in the art world, all different walks of it, hoping to get answers, at least initially, to some rather basic questions, like, how do you do art? Like, why do you care about it? Why are you passionate about it? And instead of answers, I got threats, warnings. A seasoned art collector told me that my plan was impossible, maybe even dangerous. It was, very bad idea if I wanted to keep living in New York City. It was sort of implied that, like, should I go through with this? Witness protection might be a good idea. Someone basically threatened to trash my reputation, personal, professional, psychological, if I wrote anything they disagreed with. And I was really taken aback by this. I mean, I felt like an FBI agent trying to get in with the mob. And for me, maybe I was being naive, but I was surprised. I felt like, based on everything that the art world advertises about itself, I'd expected to find this group of open-minded, free thinkers who just wanted to embrace as many people as possible in the warm hug of art. Maybe I should have come directly here, and I would have experienced that. I am feeling very embraced by the warm hug of art in this moment. But that was not what happened to me several years ago when I tried to begin getting into the art scene. I should say that there is nothing that gets a journalist's interest more like being told to stop asking questions. So obviously I continued. And, I think what began to emerge is that there is a hidden logic in the way that the art world tries to keep people out. But as we're going to talk about, there is a way around it. Now, I eventually did succeed in getting my first job and working as an assistant at this very cool up-and-coming gallery in Brooklyn, this sort of out-of-the-way spot for the in-the-know. And as I started spackling walls and writing press releases, I began to be initiated into what I would describe as the strategic snobbery that the upper echelons of the art world use to keep people out. But first, as my boss informed me, I needed a makeover. He pulled me aside, I remember over lunch one afternoon, to tell me, of course this is verbatim, how can you forget anyone telling you this? You're not the coolest cat in the art world, so having you around, it's just like lowering my coolness. I needed sort of a new look, severe haircut, no jewelry. I needed to tone down my superficial enthusiasm. The true art connoisseur, you may have noticed, exclusively discusses art in an affectless monotone that makes them sound like they're running out of batteries. I needed to nix certain words from my vocabulary. A work is not sold, it's placed. It is not a website, it is an online viewing room. I needed to develop fluency in art speak. What an art critic calls the indexical marks of the artist's body would be finger painting to you and me. These days, to sound like you know something about art, the trick is really to sound like a French professor who's been the victim of a terrible translation job, which is actually, some people argue, the origins of art speak. And art speak is so interesting to me. I mean, probably because I'm a writer and language is something I think a lot about. But this is something that is so pervasive, and this will not surprise you if you've ever heard art speak, but it did not evolve for clear communication. There was an interesting study of art world press releases that found that the words spatial and non-spatial get used interchangeably. But art speak, evolved to really be this exclusionary code. It's something that distinguishes you as someone who is sort of in or out, is, one of these select few or is not. And as I got further into the rhythms of the art world, I began to understand just how deep these deliberately erected barriers to entry go. It wasn't just me, just I guess a pro or a con, but there are galleries, right, that are located less like stores, and gallery, I should say, is art speak for art store. But they're located less like stores than speakeasies. They're like up a flight of stairs in a building that could just as easily house apartments. A lot of them, when they have these little signs out front, emit helpful words like art or gallery that would lead you to understand what's there. There is also, this tendency to refuse to share prices and then decline to sell you something even if it is for sale. Again, here we are, I think is a wonderful exception. I love the fact like the prices are there, you can see it, makes it easy to buy art. That is not the case everywhere. There is a sense in many parts of the fine art world where, even more than you are judging the work as a potential buyer, the gallery is judging you. If there was a silver lining to understanding all of this, it's that I wasn't totally insane. I felt like, no wonder I'd felt so alienated by the art world. The art world was evidently sort of doing its best to keep out the Joe Schmoes, which was one gallerist's term for general public. And there, is certainly a sort of twisted logic to these efforts. I think all of these deliberately erected barriers to entry, they function as a way to build mystique. They concentrate power in the hands of gatekeepers. They create this idea of art as being for a select, self-anointed few. It was also very frustrating. I mean, I, as I said, was dead set on developing my eye, this visual literacy. And an eye to art connoisseurs is, not just an organ, it is this painstakingly cultivated outlook that, as they put it, could enable you to see so much that doesn't meet the eye. Like, what is transcendent about a sculpture of vegetables on a mattress? Or, who's going to be the next Picasso? And I was really dead set on not just staring in art's direction, but actually being able to see it, to have a conversation with it. And what was disturbing to me is that this sort of strategic snobbery, it existed not only when it came to finding the art or buying it, but also to appreciating it. So many of these art experts that I was meeting spent, to me, surprisingly little time discussing the merits of the artworks themselves. And instead they asked questions like, where do the artists go to school? Where have they shown their work? Who are they sleeping with right now? And that was referred to as the context, right? Context was kind of the web of names around an artist. It was the social cachet of the artist. And that, so much more than the work itself, seemed to determine people's judgment of the work, its value, whether it merited a place in the art historical canon. As one gallerist that I spent time with put it, I mean, really one of his go-to questions when deciding whether to show an artist was, is this someone I would want to hang out with? So it didn't sit well with me. I felt like, I want to develop my eye, and instead I was being encouraged to outsource my opinion to the hive mind. And all of that emphasis on context also felt like one more way to keep out the schmoletariat, because these connoisseurs become that much more important if we're told that we need years of going to art fairs, several advanced degrees, and the right shirt to commune with a painting. Now, I had initially spent a number of months working, as I said, with this great gallery in Brooklyn, and I began to be frustrated. I felt like I was sort of coming up against a wall in terms of being able to see more with art. And after having spent this time, I began to hear about Miami. There's this thing started percolating in there. It was like, are you doing Miami? And Miami was short for Miami Art Week, which was short for this week-long bacchanal of pills, parties, powders, held in the name of shopping for art. As one person described it, it was this week of, countless fairs. One of the big ones was Art Basel, Miami Beach, but dozens of others. I lost track. Someone described it to me as, it is like the bourgeois indulgence that precedes a communist revolution. So I felt like I'd experienced what art connoisseurs refer to as like the pure in the art world, and I wanted to see the puerile. I was like, I think, let's see what I might get out of this experience. And so I actually managed to convince another different gallery to let me tag along with them to do the fairs. They agreed to take me on the condition that I get in there and start selling the work. So I spent a week not eating, on my feet, schmoozing with millionaires, selling art from the backseat of Ubers, touring art collections in private homes that make like Union Station look small, and also binging on art. I mean, people knock fairs, are like, oh, it's a terrible way to see art, whatever. It's an amazing way to see a lot of art. And I did like a supermarket sweep of art. I saw so much. I was constantly, I barely slept. And at the end of that week, I began to realize that I had binged on a very particular type of art, what some people in the art world would rather dismissively call couch art. Couch art is synonymous with what they also dismissively refer to as colorful painting. On the other opposite end of the spectrum, you have what is casually referred to as like fuck you art, which does not play so nicely. It's not so easily sold. And I would say after a week of really bonding with a particular type of art that was, sold well at fairs, I began to crave something a little weirder. And it was interesting. This whole experience was really, I felt like I went through these repeated kind of identity crises when it came to my own sense of taste. And this was one moment where I felt it maybe shifting in a way that I didn't recognize. And so I came back to New York craving weird art. One of my excursions to find weird art led me to a gallery called Catbox Contemporary, which is based out of a cat scratching post in someone's apartment. So if you've ever seen yay high, like cats scratch on it, it's that. I mean, the sculptures are quite small, as you can imagine. But one of the artists who was having a show there invited me a few days later to go with her to an opening of another artist, an artist named Mandy Allfire. She texted me the press release. I'd never heard of Mandy Allfire, but according to the press release, Mandy Allfire was an artist who, and I'm giving you her context, had an MFA from Columbia, just like one of the top art schools in the country, if you're counting, and a track record of performing at some of the top arts venues in the country. She had also been performing for the last few years as an ass influencer on Instagram. You are a kind of person who comes to hear a writer talk on a weekday at a gallery, so I don't presume that any of you are intimately familiar with ass influencing. So I'm just going to go ahead and define this for you. This is someone who has developed a rather robust following on social media by posting photos of their butt. And so Mandy, who had hundreds of thousands of followers at this point, had invited her fans to come to this gallery for a live face sitting in which she was going to sit on their faces until, and I quote, they couldn't take it anymore. Now, I don't know about you all, but I read this press release and I was like, well, this is the decline and fall of Western civilization. We are living through it. I was like, I want to believe that I'm into whatever avant-garde tomfoolery people are doing in the art world these days. I want to believe that my tastes have evolved and I can appreciate this, but this has gone too far. It also was not every day that a real live artist invited me to go with them to an opening. So I thought, I felt like a gauntlet had been thrown and I kind of needed to step up to the plate. And so I said, yeah, sure, I'll go with you to this opening. Knowing, of course, that no, it was not for me, very skeptical. I want to read you a very brief excerpt from what happened next. I think all you need to know is that we're it's kind of like lower ceilings. We're in Brooklyn. There's a lot of brick around us. It's around 7:30 at night, and Mandy Allfire is the artist. People were lined up 3 deep around Allfire, and I bobbed and weaved for a view. Orange wires dangled from the ceiling next to pairs of Allfire's lacy underwear. "Work that ass, work it," called a man's voice over the auto-tuned rap that thumped from a speaker somewhere. At one end of the gallery, behind a red velvet rope and on a cot fitted with a wrinkled sheet, was Allfire herself. The art was already happening. Allfire's butt faced the audience. She wore gold hoop earrings, black eyeliner, and lacy black lingerie. A middle-aged man, slick as a manatee in nothing but leopard underwear, was stretched out on the mattress with Allfire straddling his face. Her bare feet dangled over the front of the mattress, her knees pressed the cot, and her butt crack smushed the guy's receding hairline. Like a discerning mattress shopper testing the merchandise, Allfire bounced gently on his nose. "Rich, you're next, right? You're next, right? You only live once, Rich," babbled a guy a few inches from Allfire's left foot, while Rich stayed mute. The crowd was equally split between men and women, with approximately 1 million raised iPhones, as well as some National Geographic quality digital cameras. "Have you ever been sat on before?" asked Allfire. She held a microphone up to her butt. "Never," said a muffled voice from under her. "Mom's your biggest fan. Can I push down harder on you?" "Woohoo, harder, harder." For 15 minutes, Allfire roosted on the man's head while she read fan mail from her followers. There were occasionally whistles, a few woos. "Rich, do it, Rich, do it, Rich. Come on, do it, Rich. Come on, you only live once, man," said Rich's friend, while Rich, I assume, wanted to die. Allfire swiveled on the man's forehead and tossed her booty-length black hair over her shoulder. She put her hands on her hips and looked over her shoulder at the crowd. "Is anybody else going to participate?" I have this moment on video. I've watched it at least 50 times trying to make sense of what happened next. The blurry 22-second clip pans jerkily over someone's dirty white Converse and over a woman filming with a Steadicam, then back to Allfire's cot. Allfire adjusts herself on the guy's face, flips around, says, "Is anybody else going to participate?" and stares directly at my iPhone. Then the recording cuts off. That's when I raised my hand. When I try to think back to that moment, all I see is a solid black expanse where my brain should be. Did I think it through? I wouldn't have done it if I'd thought it through. Everyone and their mother was videotaping, I remembered belatedly, as my feet carried me to the front of the room. Any hope of a political career was over, I thought. The least of my worries, but that's where my addled mind went. I thought of my poor, oblivious husband, probably knitting quietly by the fireside at home. I couldn't have said what I expected to discover by having my airways squished by a pantsless woman I'd never met, but I guess I figured art would never change my life unless I took a few chances. And anyway, before I could figure out how to politely tell Allfire I'd made a terrible mistake, thank you, but no thank you, I was stretched out on a wrinkled white sheet, covered in a full-body sweat, staring up at Allfire's bare thighs. Darkness descended. Wet warmth spread over my forehead, nose, cheeks, mouth, and chin. After a few moments, a tightness cinched my chest. The room was silent. There were a few scattered laughs. "You might have a girlfriend after," someone called. "Make this sexy, please," said another voice. That creeped me out. I reached for my Notice 5 Things safety blanket. It was extremely dark. A minute went by. Come to think of it, I'd never been anywhere so dark. Mandy was back to reading fans' messages. "I want to smell your farts." And it dawned on me that I could feel Mandy laughing before she laughed, could sense my forehead trembling before my ears heard the ha-ha. It was primal. It was like being in the deepest pit of a hug or a cave. A few more minutes passed and my mind drifted. Was this like being in the womb? A reverse womb? Something about being born again? 7 minutes went by. My breathing had slowed. My heart had stopped thudding. Mandy's body pressed mine securely. It was surprisingly peaceful. Truth be told, I wouldn't have minded taking a nap. So I had this experience, and I couldn't stop thinking about Mandy Allfire's work. And there were a number of reasons for this, but one of them was that it made me realize, as I was struggling with it and talking about it with the owner of the gallery where I was working at the time, is it made me realize that there was a rather fundamental question that I still couldn't answer, which is, what is art? And this set me on a mission to try and figure it out. I went to my local library. I took out vertiginous stacks of skyscrapers. It's a miracle they didn't fall on me and crush me to death on my desk. I read so much art criticism and philosophy so that you don't have to. You're welcome. And basically came up with, on the one hand, this answer that after many years, experts have sort of thrown up their hands at this question. They're like, we just don't know what art is, sorry. On the other hand, I was really fascinated to learn that our idea of what art is today is incredibly deeply shaped by these rather arbitrary decisions made by status-conscious Europeans in the 1760s who, again, rather arbitrarily decided there was a handful of human undertakings that qualified as fine art, painting, sculpture, poetry, architecture on a good day, and everything else was mere craft. And art was made by honest-to-God genius artists. They made things that could alter our souls, but the craft was, shoes and needlepoint and all that stuff that was useful, but just made by regular old artisans. And that's something that has really persisted with us to this day. And yet, for thousands of years, art was considered anything involving human ingenuity and skill. Passing laws, training horses, carving marble, blowing glass. And I think for me, what was very powerful about sort of the experiences, I started actually working with Mandy, her offline name is Amanda Alfieri, and working with her on her work and wrestling with these conversations and these questions together, was it began to help me see that art could be in so many more places than I had initially realized. And that is very much an attitude that I saw artists embrace. And it was one that I began to internalize only after I started working with artists. And it was when I started working with these up-and-coming emerging artists, I felt like I began to understand a different way of looking at art, but also of looking at the world around me. So, there was something that really clicked as I sat there like stretching canvases and painting backgrounds in their studios. And I felt like I was beginning to learn how to savor art more like an artist. When you go to these galleries and museums, there's so much hushed murmuring about historicity and indexicality and liminal space and postmodernism. And yet, when you're in an artist's studio, and you know this if you've made art or you've been in that space, it's practically athletic. Like nothing had prepared me for the blistery business of actually making art. Like I lost patches of arm hair to a sculpture. I nearly lost fingers to stapling guns. I watched artists sweating for hours to get the exact right shade of gray. And we've been told really for the last 100 years or so that what matters about art is the idea behind it, like the thought trumps the thing. And yet, as Julie Curtis, one of the artists I work for, put it, an idea is not a painting. Painting is constant decision-making. And I think for me, there was this revelation that thinking about art more like an artist opened up this whole new side of it. But you had to slow down. You had to pay attention to the physical form. You had to examine the decisions that went into that piece, to leave a piece of it looking a little messy, to not make that foot look realistic. And for the first time in my life, when I went back to galleries and museums, I started to actually ignore the wall labels next to the artworks. And the wall labels, are not just, these are actually called, the technical term, I love this, is tombstones, that list, the name of the piece, the artist, when it was made, the materials. But there's also, as you probably know, these paragraph-long descriptions of the work that are in a lot of museums. I used to think it was downright rude when there wasn't one of those next to every single work. I was like, how the heck am I supposed to figure out what is going on unless you explain it to me in English with words? When I started working as a guard at the Guggenheim, I actually started standing in front of the wall labels so that people couldn't see them. I was a huge asshole, but I felt like they cut people's own interpretations off. They suggested there was one right answer to the work. And I felt that for myself, I really began to challenge myself to slow down. I mean, working as a guard, I had hours and hours with these works, let me tell you. But we can all stand to slow down. There's research that shows that many of us spend more time reading those wall labels than looking at the works itself, that maybe we spend 2 seconds on the work, 17 seconds on the work. So I have to slow down. I also began to really challenge myself to stay in the work. There was just this advice I got from one artist during a studio visit. This seems so simple, but was very helpful to me and continues to be, which was just to notice 5 things in a piece. They don't have to be grandiose. It does not have to be this probes, the liminal space between human-animal relations in the age of climate change. It could just be these 2 streaks of yellow at the top look like a dancer's legs in the air. Or, I don't know, that green makes me want to bite it or something, And I felt like gradually I at least began to see work face to face. I feel like I was seeing it with less pretense and more mystery than ever before. And it convinced me that everything we need to have a meaningful experience of art is right in front of us. it also dawned on me that I think context is such a tempting crutch for us to rely on, or such a tempting shortcut, because that's how our brains work, right? We do not look on the world like video cameras, like this one here, dispassionately, accurately recording the things around us. Our brains are really trash compactors, and we have these filters of expectation that descend and preemptively sort, dismiss, categorize all the raw data coming in even before we get the full picture. It's how we evolved to be able to spot the predator, moving in the bushes to jump out at us. We had to just kind of gloss over the whole scene and just be attuned to these little finite changes and details. And the result is, as scientists will tell you, that vision is a hallucination. What we think of as reality is to a great extent belief and assumption. And in the course of my years in the art world and working on what became the book, I've encountered many different explanations that I try to capture for why art matters and how any of us can engage with it more deeply. But some of these resonated more with me than others. And one explanation in particular that both scientists and artists have arrived at is that art is actually crucial to our experience as human beings because it helps us fight those reducing tendencies of our minds. Looking at art is not always pleasant. It can, as some scientists say, hurt our sense of beauty. But in a way like dreams, art introduces these perplexing, unsolvable images, these new experiences that we haven't encountered before, that essentially introduce a glitch into our brains. It's a glitch that is a gift. It's a glitch that knocks our brains off their well-worn pathways and essentially helps them jump the curb. And I want to end with one final thought before I open it up for questions, and now's your chance to think if you have any, which is just that I believe that there is an artist in each of us to the extent that we struggle to keep our brains from compressing our felt experience of the world. And I think part of that means looking for art beyond the context of a white cube, of a posh gallery or museum. It means being open to experiencing the jostle that we get from art with the everyday. And I think that's what artists are so good at doing. And that's, I think, what's interesting and perplexing about Mandy's work. But, artists have this gift to sort of look at a motorcycle or a sewage treatment plant the way that they might look at a sculpture, with this extra moment, this willingness to ponder it, to sort of examine its form, to marvel at the sort of fragile mystery of these things around us. And I think art helps us see that. So in a sense, art is a choice. It's a fight against complacency. And it's ultimately a decision to live a life that is richer, more complex, and so much more beautiful. I'm going to pause there. And if I'm doing things with everyone, with all of our chaperones' permission, I guess open it up for questions. Yeah, if you have any. Oh, thank you. I'll open up for applause, adulation, questions. Yeah. Or we can also all hang out and enjoy this wonderful show, The Art of Tea, right? Am I capturing, is that right? Yes, which is so wonderful to be a part of. There's so many pieces I want to take home.
What do you think the role of the critic is?
Interesting. So what do I think the role of the critic is? I think it's, I think there's many different roles of it. One thing that I find interesting, and there were a number of different individuals like early on and throughout this journey who made an interesting observation that they argue that criticism has really actually changed a lot over the last 100 years, and that art criticism used to be more, I don't know if vicious is the right word, but like that, you think about when you read restaurant reviews, like it's good or it's bad. I mean, there's some real kind of pans, right, where people are like, the food was awful, it was terrible. And there was a curator who actually made the point that art criticism used to be a bit more like that, whereas I think now oftentimes I find that it's, certainly there are critics who have negative things to say about shows, but it tends to be, I think, more perhaps explanatory or descriptive. And oftentimes if someone is writing about a show, it's because they think it needs attention and is positive, which is great. I think that there is a space for that. I just think it's also interesting to think about, have we lost something with perhaps a less toothless criticism? What would we gain if it was somehow harsher? I mean, I think that I don't want to be, I feel like I'm like courting, bad karma or something. Like for all the critics out there, please write nice things about my work. But I also think that there is a certain respect that you give by be willing to engage with someone's work, good or bad, and just give it airtime. I do think for artists who are trying to build a career, criticism is a way to help their work get greater visibility and also kind of exist in history longer than a show does, if that makes sense. It's a way to sort of like a show is generally up for like 4 to 6 weeks. And when you write about that show, you add to the longevity of the work. It's a way of, I think just in terms of artists' own kind of career developments, it's sort of another thing to point to in terms of recognition from your community. But I think that there is something to be said for just the way that it helps gain visibility and sort of elevate a work to a broader audience, which is, I think, what so many artists really want, is just for more people to spend time with their work, like one person to another. I do think of artworks, I think there's something to be said for interacting with another artwork, sort of like we do with a person. You've got to be there in person. You've got to give it some time. And, the work that you're friends with may not be the work that I'm friends with, and that's totally fine. Any other thoughts, questions? Please.
So you talked in your book about going, I think you went to Yale, and you were talking about meeting with artists who are trying to meet with gallery owners and present their work, and it becomes about context for them and how they present. So if you were giving advice to somebody who's up and coming, is it focus on your art, or do you need to be focusing on your story and your context that's around that in your art setting?
Yeah. Look, I wish that I could just say, just make great art. Like, that's what I want to say, and I think that I hope that will become the case. And I think that is crucial. But I also think based on just the sort of gatekeeping mechanisms that I saw, I think that the context continues to be important. I do think that there's work, though, that we can do as viewers to begin to change the system and to try and, this machine, artists refer to the whole process of galleries and museums and canonization as the machine. And I don't think it's easy to fix the flaws in the machine overnight, but I think that each of us, if we care and are willing to do it, can begin to do so by developing our own eye. And there's this sort of term that like a lot of people buy with their ears, not with their eyes. Everyone says they buy with their eyes, not with their ears, but the market would sort of suggest otherwise. And I think that in terms of any of us developing our eye, I think, what I talked about before is spending time with the work, paying attention to the decisions that an artist made, but also being adventurous with your tastes, being willing to see art that you think that you don't like, art that you've never heard of. After having spent time in museums, I love museums. At the Guggenheim, I really fell in love with this hunk of marble, the Konstantin Brancusi sculpture. And yet, I do think that there is something to be gained by us spending less time in museums around the quote-unquote masterpieces and more time seeking out the uncelebrated art, the undiscovered art, the unknown art, spending time in places like this one, going to galleries and basements and living rooms, going to art schools. Because I do think that part of developing our eyes, seeing a lot of work and also challenging ourselves. And my hope is that if each of us developed our eye and felt confident in our eye, that we could sort of help a greater range of artists, of artistic expressions, of art forms flourish. Right now the art market is really a winner-take-all model where a very small number of the people gain an outsized, share of the pie. And I don't think that that's, I think that if we could move away from context and really just focus on the work, I'm optimistic that maybe that could help. So I guess this is my my plea to all of you to like try and help artists and try and help yourself in the process. And if you do so, by the way, you can buy work for less money than you would if everyone's chasing after the same things. And there's just I think that the art world does preach this idea of artificial scarcity. There's an idea that genius is in short supply. And just based on everything I've seen, I don't buy that. There's so much great art out there. Any other thoughts? Please.
So I understand the initiative to like hide the object label at the Guggenheim, that makes sense. And that's written by a third party. But then you also talked about how you met a lot of the artists through the galleries, and the colored cubes, that work that you sold.
Oh yes, right, yes. The painting, the photographs. Yeah. Yes, yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, do you think that kind of contextual information is you're able to go more into it because you've heard the story behind it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no. Like, I think context can be helpful. And I mean, if you ask me, like, oh, I mean, I'm not going to stand here and lie to you all and be like, I never read the wall labels. Like, I have evolved to this higher plane where the art just like melds with my brain and we are one at all times. No, like, of course I cheat. And yet I still, I do think that they should write. I think if they're going to have wall labels, I do think that they should write to us as human beings and dispense with the jargon. I mean, a lot of them read to me like the world's hardest reading comprehension exam. But look, I do think that context can be helpful. And I think that for some people that is a really exciting path into the piece. I was just talking to someone who was like, what they love about the work is the way that it can function as sort of a historical document or artifact. And I had this experience actually of touring the Guggenheim, a different show with an artist, and she would look at the work and have this amazing experience, but then eventually after she'd sort of had this conversation, and she had an interesting line. She was like, I think, staring at the work and reading the wall label, it's like you're trying to have a conversation with the piece, but someone keeps interrupting. And so I think it is important just to give yourself that moment. But yeah, of course, if that's then helpful to you to kick off another layer of interpretation, that's great. And I watched her do that, where we would look at the work and then she would gradually kind of see, okay, well, when was it made? Or and that would kick off this whole other set of interpretations for her of like, wow, so that work was actually earlier than that one. What does that mean in terms of the artist development? Or I mentioned, I think in the book, there was this piece where I eventually was looking at the materials that it was made with, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out where the velvet was used in the piece. And, so I think, of course, it can be helpful and do what works for you. I just think, I do think, though, that there are tools that are available to each of us that are actually rather lightweight, but simply require curiosity and attention. And but that being said, if you want to go get a PhD in art history, like, God bless you. Please.
Do you think that some of the gatekeeping and barriers entering the art world to create that artificial scarcity you're talking about is because of sort of the proliferation of images and data and ability for people to be artists now? Because people in the community are worried that the value will get diluted over time and we're on the same kind of like art that stands the test of time.
Interesting, right. So the question was, do I think that the gatekeeping that exists is partially responds, you're saying, to like just the proliferation of images, an attempt to sort of single out some things perhaps as being unique? Possibly. I mean, I think that, although it's there, so in this history of, it's a great book called The Invention of Art, and he talks about this moment in the 1760s where we begin to distinguish fine art from craft, and this was also a moment where we began to see the first kind of galleries. And I think there was this great line by this historian about how, like, from the get-go they were pretty snobby. So I don't know, like, yeah, maybe. I think that certainly that's part of it, right? I think that there is this effort to suggest that, like, there is something unique and special, and you cannot have this experience anywhere else except here for a good sum of money. And I think that, I just don't know. I think when I think about ways that we could change it, it's like the art market, goes through a lot of people right now are sort of concerned that like the market is a bit soft right now, that people are not buying as much art. And I do think that there is a sort of phenomenon in which the art market, the fine art market, has relied on a relatively small group of people to keep this ecosystem afloat. And to me, there's something exciting to think about. Well, what if we just made it easier for a lot of people to buy art? It is not right now that easy of a process. I mean, it's not as easy as like buying jeans or a sofa. And the thing is, like, there is a lot of there's so many artists who just have closets and closets full of work. And, look at it. It's fantastic that we can be here and you could spend $100 and go home with, an original piece of art and support a living, working artist in that moment. And I think that, while I understand the reasons for a lot of that gatekeeping, part of me also wonders if at the same time, we might be able to think about different models. And I think it's interesting to think like, what terrible thing might happen, or would nothing terrible happen?
Not necessarily a follow-up, but there is like a concept where you can buy shares, like pieces of very valuable art.
The Masterworks thing. Yeah, right. Yeah, there's a company out there in particular where you can, buy shares in like a Rothko, right? And you'll never actually get to probably have that Rothko, but you can, it's kind of like buying a star, right? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I haven't looked into it deeply, but it's always in my mind been like, you can, Please.
So definitely the way you were describing kind of slowing down and looking closely at art as being a way to break up the autopilot really resonates. But it also sounds very like meditation or almost like a spiritual practice. And I know that certainly for the artist, that's the case, the way you're describing it. Also, it can do that for the viewer. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when we talk about slowing down, I mean, it can mean 5 minutes. Like, I don't know about you. I don't know how many of you have really forced yourself to spend even 5 minutes uninterrupted with an artwork. But if you haven't done that, work up to 5, but then do 15, then do 50, then spend an hour, spend 2 hours. And I do think that really interesting things happen. And I loved that experience of, there were works that couldn't sustain me, honestly, that I couldn't spend that much, and I would be frustrated to get back into that gallery as a guide. And then there were works where I could find something new every single time. And I actually just had, took a walk with one of my former colleagues at the Guggenheim who was a guard. He was like, "Oh, did you know that there's a paperclip imprint in the pedestal of that Brancusi sculpture?" And I was like, "No, I can't wait to see it. It's amazing." But I think that there is, certainly something, a lot of collectors do talk about art in very spiritual terms. And I think that there is a way in which time with art can deeply reorient you. It can also do things to you on a physical basis. I mean, on a physical level, there's this whole, Stendhal syndrome where people go to pieces crying and dizzy in front of pieces of work, or, a woman at the Cy Twombly wing of the Meal Collection in Houston who the guard came in to find her totally stripped naked in front of the work. And I will say that to me, one of my favorite parts often of going to see art is actually leaving the gallery or the museum and walking out and seeing art everywhere. I'll leave the Met and look at a hot dog cart. I'm like, oh my God, this is the most incredible sculpture I've ever seen. Look at these hyper saturated colors, and this is the slutty hot dog, and the cheese coming out of this burger. It's just, and that's very exciting. And I do think that it is a way to, I don't know if this is spiritual, but it is a way to reconnect with different parts of the world and open yourself up to new sources of information and chaos and nuance. And like I said, beauty. And to, in the process, discover beauty where you may never have seen it before. Should we do maybe 2 last ones if there are 2? Yeah, please. And then we can hang out. We'll be, signing books and looking at art.
For me, it was the handwritten Arabic on the wall card.
Say that again, what? Oh, yeah.
Ask I guess you could say, a very materialistic question. My son is autistic and an artist, and so he cannot advocate for himself. When I went to the Outsider Art Festival in New York City, I found the same sort of insularity you're talking about, as in you're not on the inside, go away small boats. What are alternative ways for me to try to bring his work into the world, which, as objectively as I can, I admire, and other people have too?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would love to see it. And that's wonderful that he's making art. I think that, I wish I had I wish I could stand here and be like, this is it. This is the answer right here. We're going to solve it. And I sympathize, it's hard. I do think that what I've seen artists do with great success is to build a community of other artists. And I understand maybe there's a different form that takes in your case, but I think maybe that's helpful in whatever permutation applies. But I think artists in that period of frustration and longing of sort of waiting to have the opportunities to show their work, for the gallery to come knocking, because galleries, as I write, standard issue on the website, don't call us, we'll call you. They do studio visits with other artists. They build a community of artists. They show up for each other. They share information. They talk about process. They critique each other's work. And things often, I think, begin to happen. And at the very least, you're getting to share and you're getting to be a part of something. There are also galleries, I'd have to look them up, but there are some galleries outside of the ones that may go there that have as their focus, I think, people like your son, that they may be able to, that there are worth targeting and seeing if they might be interested in this work. I mean, it's, ending our world, but, social media is also a way to bypass the galleries. And so, having a website, having an Instagram, just making sure that it's visible and out there is also an easy first step. Trying to think if there are other platforms. I don't know, you could also run I'm not advocating lying, but you could run a social experiment where you make up a resume and, there's scientific studies where they have, you're looking too interested. This is mostly a joke, but but there's there's some scientific study where I think it's they have resumes for a woman versus a man, and they see how hiring managers react. And, so I'm maybe if you came up with this, I don't know. We'll talk later. I'm not going to talk about this, right? Anyway, one more question. Yeah, please.
I guess this is a more personal question based on something that you mentioned earlier about the painting with the carrots. Is that your grandfather?
Yeah, my grandfather.
My grandpa was also a Holocaust survivor, and I guess I'm just wondering, did you speak to your parents about that? Because oftentimes I've spoken to my dad about what he knows about his father, and I wish that I could have spoken to my grandfather about his experience. Did you get the chance to speak to your grandfather, and did you go further with that, thinking about the work that your grandfather did with your parents?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so my grandmother was no longer alive when I sort of rediscovered the work that she had made, and so I wished that, and we had talked about so many things. I mean, she was really an absolutely incredible woman who could talk about all the things that she and her family had been through, but with humor and life, and was just so inspiring in that way. But we never really discussed the art question specifically. I didn't, I don't know that I talked to my parents about it. About that a little bit later, I sort of asked them about her relationship with the art, but I didn't find it hugely revealing. Although what I have done recently that's been so amazingly special is growing up. She would always talk about one of the children that she taught, who was this boy Joshua, who had grown up as she talked about him this. I mean, celebrity. I mean, his name was just in our household. And he was a boy that she had taught in this DP camp. And in the midst of writing the book, I decided partially to sort of fact check my understanding and, to your point, try and understand more about this period of her life. I like looked him up online. He was living in New York. He was on the Upper West Side, and like went to go and have breakfast with him and his wife. And we just had dinner again a few weeks ago, and it's just been really wonderful. Like I just, there's so much in him that reminds me of that incredible generation and of my grandmother. And so that has been a really special experience, and is something that has like shed a bit more light on sort of what happened in this moment and the way that art brought them together and continues to bring us together in a way that is so incredible and amazing. So yeah, well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your questions. We'll all be here together. Have a great night.
Soundstripe.
They say I'm young, they say I'm dumb, but what they don't know is where I've been and who I am, all the ways I've grown. Blood and the sweat, tears and regret made me hard as stone. On my own, on my